very thankful to be a visitor here in the beautiful traditional territory of the Sami peoples. And I thank the organizers of this forum for your kind invitation and for taking such good care of us while we're visiting here. So I'll begin, as I always do, by acknowledging with respectful gratitude the many survivors of the Indian residential school system, their families, and their communities. I've been, during the time I've worked with survivors, I've been so humbled and inspired by survivors. And without their courage, their resilience, and their vision, there would have been no Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada. So the Commission situates the history and the legacy of the residential school system in the broader context of colonization, and it calls for the sweeping transformation of colonial systems, institutions, and relationships across Canadian society. Such actions are necessary to remedy the social, economic, and cultural and educational inequities that have oppressed and impoverished Indigenous peoples in their own homelands. So the TRC's vision of long-term reconciliation hinges on the fundamental right of Indigenous peoples to be self-determining peoples who, as holders of treaty, constitutional, and human rights, are actively reclaiming and revitalizing their land-based cultures, languages, oral histories, laws, and governance systems. So the TRC reframes history, truth, and reconciliation through the lens of Indigenous rights. So I'll just say a few brief words about the residential school system itself. So from the 1880s to the 1990s, there were over 140 government-funded church-run residential schools and hostels across Canada, including across the north. More than 150,000 children, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children, were taken from their families. And at the time that the Commission began its work, there were approximately 80,000 living survivors in Canada. In documenting the history of the residential school system that existed in Canada for well over a century, the TRC found that the most significant expansion of residential schools in the post-1940 period took place in the Canadian North. So as Canada sought to strengthen its sovereignty in the North and increase access to the rich resources of the region in the post-World War II period, residential schooling played a significant role in disrupting and transforming the traditional land-based lifestyles and economies of northern Indigenous peoples. And this was particularly the case in the eastern Arctic and northern Quebec, now Nunavut and Nunavik respectively, where the introduction of residential schooling was only one of several traumatic changes, including things such as forced relocations and increasing government intervention in all aspects of life. So the Commission found that the children who went to the schools suffered emotional, physical, and/or sexual abuse. The residential school system was underfunded. Buildings were chronically overcrowded, sanitation was poor, and disease rates were high. The children had unhealthy diets, and we had many survivors tell us about their experiences of having to steal food at schools because they were so hungry. Children were punished for speaking their own language or trying to follow their own cultural and spiritual practices. They became disconnected from their families, couldn't speak their language, and lost their connection to land-based lifeways. Many ran away from the schools, and some of them died, while others were taken back to school and punished. Many children never went home to their families. So the TRC, in doing its work on what came to be known as the Missing Children Project, established a national residential school student death register and was able to confirm at the time that the report was published that 3,200 children had died in residential schools, and some of them are buried in residential school cemeteries. but we know that there are so many more, and this really important work that the TRC began has to continue. So the TRC issued some very specific calls to action so that this work could continue in the post-TRC period. So I'll just say a little bit about how Canada's TRC was established. It's distinct from other commissions, some of the ones that Eduardo mentioned this morning, in that it wasn't established by the state, but through the court system. So there were 5 components to the, first of all, I would just say that by 2005, former students had filed more than 18,000 civil lawsuits and several class action lawsuits against the federal government that funded the schools and the Protestant and Catholic churches that ran the schools. So an out-of-court settlement agreement was negotiated in 2006 to settle what is still, I believe, the largest class action lawsuit in Canadian history. So the magnitude and the scope of this settlement agreement is very significant in Canada. And there again, just briefly, 5 components to the settlement agreement. There was an independent assessment process, which was designed to hear and provide compensation for those former students who suffered physical and or sexual abuse. There was a common experience payment, which was a reparations payment that was based solely on the fact that a child attended a school. So it was designed to be compensation and recognition of the fact that many children lost their connections to their languages, their cultures, their families. So it was designed to address that residential school experience. There was a health support program for survivors, a commemoration program where communities could apply for funding and choose their own ways to commemorate both survivors, those who didn't return from the schools, and do that in their own way, in ways that were significant to them. And of course, the TRC itself. So we were talking a little bit earlier today also about mandates, so I'll tell you a little bit about the TRC's mandate and some of the objectives and results of the Commission's work. So the TRC mandate, and I want to sort of frame it in this particular way because I think it's a very important aspect of the TRC's mandate. Part of the mandate said that in exercising all of its duties, the Commission was to recognize the significance of Indigenous oral and legal traditions. And so throughout all of its work, both at the national events, and I'll just run through these very briefly in a minute, but in all of the Commission's activities, including the national events that were held and the report itself, both the methodology and the ways in which the sources were gathered and all of the work of the Commission happened, there was very particular attention paid to the importance of this particular aspect of the mandate. And so, and in the national events, that was framed often in the use of ceremony, the use of protocols, and the Commission would work with local Indigenous nations in each territory and province across the country as the national event was held there. So, in terms of the results of the Commission, it documented the history and the legacy of the residential school system. We gathered 7,000 survivor statements. And all of the TRC public events were also recorded. We collected millions of church and government records, and that process is still ongoing. We held 7 national events across the country. There were 238 days of hearings in 77 local communities, a final closing event in June of 2015, and overall the commissioners and staff attended approximately 900 other public forums. The Commission guided Canadians in a national truth and reconciliation process, made recommendations to government for funding of these commemoration projects that I mentioned earlier, established the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation, which is where I'm working now. And it is the legacy of, and there again, this was based on survivors' vision. They wanted to make sure that there was an ongoing, there was a continuation of the work that had been begun by the Commission. So all of the Commission's records, all of the testimonies that were gathered reside now at the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation in the archives there. And the Commission also issued a 6-volume report with 94 calls to action. So in terms of truth commissions more generally, there's growing recognition at the international level that truth and reconciliation commissions that involve Indigenous peoples should involve them in ways other than as victims giving testimony. Of course, this is an absolutely critical part of a commission's work, but that Indigenous people should have an active role in other parts of a commission's work. So in terms of the TRC in Canada, not only did survivors provide testimonial statements to the Commission, but as you can see in terms of the list here, played an active role in survivors' organizations and Indigenous leaders in developing the TRC mandate in the first place. $60 million of the settlement agreement money was allocated to the TRC, so this was not a government-funded commission. This was monies that came from the survivors themselves. We had a TRC survivor committee that advised the commission over the course of all of its work. 2 of the 3 commissioners are Indigenous and 1 is a survivor. Most TRC management staff and contractors were Indigenous peoples, and Indigenous peoples played an active role in the design and implementation of the TRC public national events and community hearings, and also an active role in establishing the TRC Inuit Subcommission. So I'll just say a couple of things about the Inuit Subcommission itself. It was established to ensure that a prominent Inuit voice and perspective was present in the national truth and reconciliation process and in the overall work of the Commission. So in terms of the planning and of all of the TRC Northern public outreach events, there were many community hearings held across the North, because of course many of these communities are quite remote, so survivors weren't necessarily able to come to the Commission at national events, so the Commission went to survivors in many of these communities. So over the course of our work, the TRC heard from many Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers whose understandings and teachings about reconciliation extend well beyond the need to remedy the significant harms of residential schools and the ongoing impacts of colonization. So we heard from many elders and knowledge keepers that while there was no word for reconciliation in their language, there are many stories, teachings, laws, ceremonies, and protocols that their nations have used for millennia to resolve conflicts, repair harms, and restore good relations amongst diverse peoples and with the land. So, and as you can see from this quote from the final report, their knowledge systems, oral histories, laws, and connections to the land have informed the reconciliation process to date and are essential to its ongoing progress, so post-TRC. So survivors told the Commission that they are more than just victims of violence, they are also holders of treaty, constitutional, and human rights. And so the Commission concluded that Indigenous peoples in Canada have the right to access and revitalize their own laws and governance systems. They have the right to protect and revitalize their cultures, languages, and ways of life. They have the right to reparations for historical harms. So the Commission made the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples the framework for reconciliation in 21st century Canada. And one of the several of the calls to action actually are related to the UN Declaration, and one of those being a key one actually, that the government fully adopt and implement the UN Declaration, as the framework for reconciliation. And the federal government, in response to this, in response to the 94 calls to action, accepted all of the 94 calls to action and has since fully endorsed without qualification the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and currently are working on developing a national framework in consultation with Indigenous peoples and others. So at the national events, there were many things that happened. There were public sharing circles, interactive history displays, youth forums, education days for students and their teachers, art exhibits, academic conferences. And so the point of this dialogue at the national events wasn't to create a consensus about what had happened in the past. Indeed, there were many contradictory views that were expressed. So it brought people together to bear witness to reflect on, and respond to survivors' testimonies. It was a powerful experience for many. And one woman said simply, "By listening to your story, my story can change. By listening to your story, I can change." So in this way, I think the Commission's work actually encouraged people to become active agents in the truth and reconciliation process in ways that would be sustainable once the Commission finished its work. So the Commission concluded that the work of the TRC has shown just how difficult the process of truth determination can be. Reconciliation is going to take hard work. So the Commission was very clear that at the end of the work, we would not have achieved reconciliation. Rather, we were laying a foundation for this work to continue in the post-TRC period. So it was going to take personal, community, and national action, action at all levels of government, governance, laws, policies must change, education and business must change, thinking and attitudes must change. So I'll just end with some of the Commissioner's own reflections in the final report. They said that the adoption of the TRC report, important though it is, would not itself change the everyday lives of women, men, and children whose experiences it honors and gives witness to. No. For this, we need the political and constitutional commitment of not only governments, but the support and goodwill of the public, of all Canadians, to create and implement substantial and meaningful changes in cooperation, in partnership with Indigenous peoples themselves. We are all in this together. We believe that Canada is at a critical turning point in the nation's history. The Commission has established guiding principles and a framework for reconciliation. It is now up to Canadians to take action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paulette. Very informative and interesting talk. Okay, we have a few minutes for questions. I can see one hand here.
Thanks, Paulette. Very interesting. I'm really curious about the NCTR. I mean, the TRC is so important, but I also think this aspect of the legacy, what comes after. So could you say a little bit more about NCTR, about what you see as its most important task to work with, and perhaps the biggest challenges in going forward?
Thank you. So essentially the NCTR's function is to be the living legacy from the work of the Commission. And so part of that, of course, as you can imagine, involves a huge archive. And that work has been going on since the beginning of the Commission and is still ongoing. So there's a whole piece around creating not just a physical archives, which is located at the national or at the University of Manitoba, but creating a virtual archive which will be accessible, online. So there's a huge sort of component of that. In addition, Statement gathering is still ongoing, so survivors who didn't come forward during the Commission's work can still provide a statement to the NCTR about their experiences in the schools. There's a huge research aspect of this as well, so building institutional partnerships, networks of research, because there again, much research will be ongoing. And I think also it's a place of dialogue. So there have been many, many events where we've brought together survivors and elders and knowledge keepers and various other people to continue the conversations around reconciliation, truth-telling, and just the whole ongoing aspects around, for example, the calls to action. So it's a very big mandate. We're a very small center, but we have many partners and supporters. So it's very, very critical work. And of course, this will benefit ultimately survivors and their families and communities who are carrying on their own work. And many communities are very interested in doing their own community histories, for example, of their residential school experiences. And so all of that kind of work is ongoing.
I am Inge Frisk of the Stockholm Sami Association, and I have a question about the impact onto the majority population of Canada. How much knowledge was transferred? Did you do any metrics, measurements before, after, so that you really can see the impacts on different levels, not only the population as such, the citizens, but also what impacts were there on all the different levels of governments you're talking about? Did you do any active measurements, and what methods did you use?
Yeah, I think that early on, and I believe it was 2008, there was a national survey done in terms of gauging the Canadian public's awareness of the residential school system, their views on reconciliation, and various other questions. And another poll was just done more recently in I don't know, half a year ago, or something. Time goes fast, but about a half a year ago now. And it does seem that people's awareness has certainly changed, increased. Having said that, we found consistently throughout the whole time that the Commission was doing its work that we met so many people who said, I didn't know anything about this history. I didn't know that this happened. And people were shocked. I think many people were shocked. Many people were upset that they hadn't known anything about this history. So I think there's a growing awareness, but there's still so much work to do. There's still so many people who don't know. And some of the calls to action that the TRC issued were specifically focused on education and the important role that education plays in all of this. So recommendations such as curriculum for K to 12 students, kindergarten to grade 12 students, so that students can learn, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous students can learn the history of not only what happened in the schools, but also about the contributions that Indigenous peoples have made to Canada. So the importance of the treaty relationships, constitutional rights, and all of those other things. So to have a much fuller and richer picture of where Indigenous peoples are in the Canadian historical narrative, if I could put it that way.
Thank